So another justification that some people bring up for the ban has to do with Official Declaration 1 from Wilford Woodruff when polygamy was ended. But Wilford Woodruff mentions this line. He says that the Lord will never allow the prophet to lead the church astray. And therefore, some people take this idea and say, well, therefore the priesthood ban must have been sanctioned by God, because otherwise this is an example of the prophet leading the church astray. Well, what thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. We've got Paul Reeve with us once more. We're not going to introduce you again because we already did that last time, and we've got a lot to talk about. So we're going to pick up where we left off. Last episode, we talked about the beginnings of the priesthood ban. We got into a lot of fascinating history. Alex and I were just sitting here listening, just soaking it all in. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to jump to the end of the priesthood ban and some of the things that happened after the priesthood ban ended in 1978. That was just me throwing a date in there to sound cool, like I know things. I don't know if anybody caught that. But what I find really fascinating about the end of the ban is how different it is compared to the beginning of the ban. The beginning, as you outlined very clearly, is just kind of a mess. And the end doesn't seem to be that way. Could you talk to us a little bit about that dichotomy?
Yeah, sure. I think President Kimball is pretty deliberate in terms of receiving a revelation. I think he recognizes that the restrictions have become so entrenched by this point, and there was a long-standing lack of consensus amongst the leadership itself, going back to the David O. McKay presidency. And I think he really then wants to make sure that there is a revelation. And so really in the Latter-day Saint scriptural canon, we have one revelation on race and priesthood, and it comes in June 1978. That should also indicate to us Brigham Young is not claiming a revelation. Prior church leaders are not claiming a revelation. They're thinking back to what they remember as historical precedent and basing their standing and policy on those historical precedents. President Kimball is claiming a revelation in June of 1978, and he sets about laying the groundwork for that when he becomes prophet.
So it's a very intentional thing that he's doing, and it reminds me of Doctrine and Covenants, where it talks about these decisions that you're making should be unanimous in the quorums that are going on. The First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, the Quorum of the 70, and President Kimball goes to each of these quorums systematically, and they come out with a unanimous decision that this ban is going to end. Brigham Young didn't do that. And in fact, there were those in leadership that pushed back on him for his views, which I just think is really interesting. But since the ban has ended, there continues to be a lot of confusion in the church among members about whether or not God wanted that ban in place or not. What are your thoughts? Tell us kind of your position on that, and then we can move into some additional thoughts.
Yeah, in terms of were the racial restrictions of divine origins? I'm very clear on that. I do not believe the racial restrictions were of divine origins. And as a historian, I think we have a very clear record that kind of creates this process whereby in fits and starts, the restrictions accumulated growing precedent and solidified over time. There's no firm line in the sand, but it just sort of starts to grow stronger and stronger, firmly, I think, in place by the beginning of the 20th century under Joseph F. Smith, and then it takes an additional 70 years to get rid of. I don't believe it's of divine origins.
Okay. And throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, before the ban ended, we saw a variety of justifications for the ban. People were talking about how, black people can't have the priesthood because they're under the curse of Cain, or they were less valiant in the pre-existence, things like that the church has openly disavowed. But since the ban has ended, it has kind of given rise to a new set of justifications for why it may have been God's will. I want to talk about some of these and maybe walk us through some of your thoughts on them. Alex, have you heard about any of these justifications?
I really, no, I haven't. And so that's why I'm really eager to hear what we have to say about all of this.
So one thing that I've heard, for example, and it's something that like I've thought of, like, oh, okay, well, maybe that makes sense. I think we've all maybe been through that. But for example, the idea that there's precedent for a priesthood restriction because in the Old Testament, only the Levites could have the priesthood and nobody else could. So maybe some people think maybe that's what's going on with the priesthood ban today. What is kind of your response to that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to challenge our own assumptions. So if the tribe of Levi explanation is based on simplified assumptions, then I think we need to dig a little bit more deeply and challenge those. First of all, we could just simply say that Professor Randy Bott at BYU was teaching that as a justification. And after that became public in the 2012 Washington Post article, the church said the things that Randy Bott was teaching are not church doctrine. So that's a really easy way to just simply say it's been declared not doctrine, and we should not continue to perpetuate it. But we can also just think through the tribe of Levi explanation. The tribe of Levi was given the authority to administer the law of Moses for all the other tribes, basically functioning the way that temple workers function in present-day Latter-day Saint temples, welcoming them into the tabernacle and helping them to fulfill the ordinances that are required according to the law of Moses. That was their duty. Mm-hmm. In other words, it didn't keep people out like the racial priesthood and temple restrictions did. It welcomed them in. There was no one that was barred from receiving all of the rituals required by the faith at that time. Whereas the racial priesthood and temple restrictions barred people just because of the color of their skin, their African ancestry, from temple admission, receiving all the ordinances that their faith, their chosen faith, said was necessary. Mm-hmm. So really stark differences. And we also need to understand that even through the entire Old Testament period, it's not just limited to the tribe of Levi. You have priesthood being used by Book of Mormon people. You have also prophets in the Old Testament who aren't of the tribe of Levi, who are presumably exercising priesthood. So we need to question maybe those standing assumptions, and just at the very base, remember that that explanation has been declared not doctrinal by the church itself in 2012.
So not doctrinal, and just in a nutshell, simply it's an apples to oranges comparison. It's not a true comparison.
Absolutely.
So speaking to the Levitical justification, I really like. We have a list actually of these justifications that you've talked about in the past, and I love the quote from, I believe it's Artis Partial, that you bring up, which is I'm going to botch it, but it's withholding, or okay, you know better than I do.
Yeah, now that you're bringing it up, I'll probably mess it up. But let's see. Limiting the priesthood to one segment of the faithful is not the same as withholding the priesthood from one segment of the faithful.
Yeah.
It's a false parallel, in other words.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. Well, what else have we got on this list?
Yeah, so there's a ton of stuff on this list, but the one that I'm looking at here is the whole Jews and Gentiles thing. So how the gospel went to the Jews before the Gentiles, and so people take that and justify it to like where maybe the priesthood would go to whites before blacks, that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's important, I think, maybe even to start in the New Testament to say that Jesus Christ obviously spread the gospel to the Samaritans. So there is even a false kind of assumption that this justification is grounded in. But let's just focus on the restoration, right? We talk about the fullness of this last dispensation. Joseph Smith claims 5 revelations that says the gospel is to be preached unto every creature. We love as Latter-day Saints to quote, unto every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. More specific than that is unto every creature. Who is supposed to be left out? Who is left out by every creature in this last dispensation. And early Latter-day Saints took that seriously. We have the evidence because they're baptizing Black people. They're not leaving them out. The gospel is to be spread to everyone. Mm-hmm. Jesus Christ declares himself twice in 1831 in the Doctrine and Covenants using first-person language. I am no respecter of persons, and he claims all flesh as his own. What shade of flesh is supposed to be left out if Christ is claiming all flesh as his own? The very first person of Black African descent baptized into the faith is a former enslaved man known as Peter, baptized in Kirtland in 1830. And there have been Black Latter-day Saints ever since. So it's just a way of erasing from Latter-day Saint history the Black Latter-day Saint pioneers, suggesting that their faith didn't matter, suggesting that their sacrifices for this faith, including enslaved Black Latter-day Saints, that their faith didn't matter. John Burton is baptized as an enslaved person in the 1830s in Missouri. His enslaver, Susan McCord, her husband dies in 1838. He helps her and her young children get to Illinois safely. The first time he enters Latter-day Saint records, he's paying $1 cash tithing in Nauvoo as an enslaved man to widow Susan Burton. That's how his cash contribution is entered into the Nauvoo tithing record. He digs a grave for a fellow Latter-day Saint in winter quarters. Eventually, he helps to found the town of Parowan, Utah. And when they decide they're going to build a proper church building, they send the clerk throughout the town to collect donations. And John Burton, an enslaved man, donates $15 to the building of the first chapel in Parowan, Utah, suggesting that the gospel was to white people first and then Black people, assumes that there were no Black Latter-day Saints before 1978 and erases the faith of people like John Burton from Latter-day Saint history. So that one in particular is just blatantly false.
Even from a priesthood perspective, like the idea that the priesthood was to go to white men first and then Black men, it's simply not historically accurate because they did have the priesthood.
That's right.
From the beginning.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Q. Walker Lewis and Elijah Abel are two most well-documented Black priesthood holders. There are others that slip past the racial restriction, especially if one drop is the measure. We know now with DNA evidence there are people of African ancestry who were ordained to the priesthood. If one drop is the measure, then there has never been a period of Latter-day Saint history without Black priesthood holders. Good luck ferreting out one drop of anyone's ancestry. We have people in the 21st century, white Latter-day Saints, who have contacted me, said, we have African ancestry in our DNA. We believe it traces back to this ancestor. So, for example, Sarah Maud Hopkins is baptized in Pennsylvania, is the first person of African ancestry that we're aware of to receive full temple rituals, and it's in 1845 in Nauvoo. She likely passed as white by that point. Her father was Black, her mother was white, and all future census records after 1840 identify her as white, but nonetheless, her descendants in the 21st century continue to have African ancestry in their DNA. So I'm just pointing out the fact that you try to police racial boundaries, good luck.
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And these are people of mixed racial ancestry who were Latter-day Saints who demonstrated profound faith. She was sealed to her husband, Peter Hopkins, who's a German immigrant in Brigham Young's office in Salt Lake, received her endowment in Nauvoo, died a practicing Latter-day Saint, and her descendants to the present continue to have African ancestry in their DNA. So by suggesting that the gospel is to go to white people first and then to Black people, you're suggesting that you can even determine who is white and Black. But also, you are erasing Black Latter-day Saints from Latter-day Saint history.
So another justification that we hear, and this kind of has arisen from the refutations of all of these other justifications. Some people just throw their hands up and say, well, we don't really know why the ban is in place. It just was, and we, accept it. God wanted it for some reason. We don't know why. What's your response to that?
Well, I don't particularly care for that explanation simply because Brigham Young is very adamant that he knows. So we can't pretend that Brigham Young's 5th of February speech just doesn't exist. And he says he knows. He says because Black people in his mind are cursed descendants of Cain, they are barred from the priesthood because Cain killed Abel. Like, he gives us the reason. So we can't at the same time say trust the prophet and then say not trust the prophet, right? Because he clearly is on record saying he knows why the racial restrictions are being articulated. So I don't care as a historian for the we don't know explanation, because we have a lot of new information. These new speeches that have been transcribed give us context that wasn't available before. And we have the Pittman version of Brigham Young's 5th of February speech, and he's clearly stating why. So it feels irresponsible to me to suggest that we don't know when we have a lot of information as to how this actually started and then accumulated growing precedent over time.
I feel like a lot of members maybe it's not the general membership probably isn't doing this research. They're not digging that deep into the origins of this practice. So I feel like the kind of the we don't know justification and some of these other justifications are more, this is what I've heard, and I'm just going to kind of parrot it out as what my opinion is. But if we dig into these historic records, it's clearly not the case.
Yeah, I think that's right.
We talked a little bit about the curse of Cain and the curse of Ham. I don't necessarily think we need to go any further with those, simply because the church has disavowed them and said, these are not true. And they're not. So don't use those. Don't perpetuate those, please. Are we missing any other ones? Paul, have you heard any that we haven't covered yet?
Well, giving Black people the priesthood would have destroyed the church is another one, right? So
I was wondering about that one too.
Yeah, the cultural context of the time in this explanation suggests that treating Black people equally would somehow have brought down the church. And it is true that accusations leveled against Latter-day Saints in Missouri were that they had opened an asylum for rogues and vagabonds and free Blacks, that they were promoting Black ascendancy over the whites, that they didn't understand the prevailing racial order in the United States, that they had invited free Blacks to Missouri to incite a slave rebellion and to steal our white wives and daughters, the Missourians said. So certainly the open racial attitude in the first couple of decades of the faith did cause problems. But did it destroy the church? No, it didn't. In my estimation, Latter-day Saints love to refer to Joseph Smith's Wentworth letter, where he says, no unhallowed hand can stop this work from progressing. And yet, treating Black people equally would. So, we have to, we can't have it both ways, in other words, right? We can't continue to simply say that the work will go forth unchallenged and then turn around and say that, well, the historical circumstances of the time made it impossible for the church to treat Black people equally. Yeah. The first couple of decades, universal priesthood in temples, right? So that was in place. And certainly it did bring outside scorn, but the outside scorn didn't go away once we implemented racial priesthood and temple restrictions. Outsiders continued to suggest that Latter-day Saint polygamy facilitated race mixing. Mm-hmm. Political cartoons across the course of the 19th century imagined Latter-day Saint polygamous families, including interracial marriages.
It's on the cover of your book.
The cover of the book is one great example, and that's published in 1904 in Life magazine. Mm-hmm. That's how long, even into the 20th century, that idea is perpetuated. So to suggest that the internal policy somehow alleviated external kind of criticism is false as well.
Wow.
So another justification that some people bring up for the ban has to do with official declaration 1 from Wilford Woodruff when polygamy was ended. But Wilford Woodruff mentions this line. He says that the Lord will never allow the prophet to lead the church astray. And therefore, some people take this idea and say, well, therefore the priesthood ban must have been sanctioned by God, because otherwise this is an example of the prophet leading the church astray. Well, what thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge we've been promised that this last dispensation will not end in apostasy as every other prior dispensation. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that God revokes a prophet's agency when he makes him a prophet. And I think it's really important to contextualize Wilford Woodruff's statement. Right? Within context, I think what Woodruff was saying makes perfect sense. The Supreme Court of the United States in May of 1890 had ruled against the late corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The church had been disincorporated by the federal government as they were attempting to bring polygamy to a halt. And finally, in the Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court said if Latter-day Saints church properties are being used for illegal purposes, that is to marry people polygamously, you can actually even start to confiscate them. So the Logan, Manti, and St. George temples are on the chopping block. And Woodruff is subpoenaed in a case that would have required him to testify if they're being used for polygamous marriages. He goes to California and returns and issues that manifesto. In response, you have some Latter-day Saints who suggest Woodruff is a fallen prophet. He's bowed to political pressure. He isn't doing God's will. He's just simply caving on polygamy because of the political pressure from the federal government. This is something that Latter-day Saints have defended for decades. And now, all of a sudden, we're going to capitulate. And President Woodruff goes around Utah Territory giving several speeches. A couple of them are recorded in Official Declaration 1, wherein he says, look, I received a revelation. He's defending the manifesto as a revelation. God showed me if we don't abandon polygamy, they're going to be running through our temples. We must abandon polygamy to preserve temple worship. God gave me a revelation. He's not going to give me a revelation that will lead us astray. Within context, he's defending the manifesto as a revelation. God won't give me a revelation that will lead us astray. Very different from a blanket statement that might suggest that anything a prophet says over the dinner table is somehow God's word. He's simply defending the manifesto as a revelation, and God will not give me a revelation that will lead us astray. He showed me, he basically claims to say that, God showed me what would happen if we cling to polygamy. We will lose our temples. The government will be confiscating them. He says the right choice to make is to abandon polygamy and preserve temple worship. And that's the choice he urges Latter-day Saints to make in the face of the accusation that he's a fallen prophet and he's bowed to political pressure. God won't give me a revelation that will lead us astray.
That's an interesting interpretation, specifying that he is defending a revelation. It's not saying that anything I say will be the right, he's not saying every word that comes out of my mouth will lead you down the correct path. He's saying this is a revelation. It's almost like he's essentially saying God is your friend. He is not your enemy. He is not going to give me a revelation that will be bad for you. And the priesthood ban, you look at that, and it wasn't presented as a revelation at all.
That's right. Brigham Young doesn't claim a revelation. He's defending his position as something that he knows is right. I think he believes it is right at the time that he's saying it, but not claiming a revelation. And in fact, the only person claiming a revelation is Spencer W. Kimball in 1978.
That was powerful. In fact, 1978. I think we have, there's one more justification that we hear sometimes. I'm forgetting what it is. We wrote it down, though.
We
typed it out.
So another justification that is out there is that this was back then when everybody was racist, that racism was totally common and it was whatever. It was just that's just how things were, So what would you say about that?
Yeah, well, I'm a historian, and historians teach against this idea of presentism. Presentism is simply the notion that we shouldn't superimpose the present on the past, meaning that where we're at in 2022 in our understandings and our practices and our policies doesn't mean that that's how things worked in 1852, for example. So I agree with that, but sometimes people push presentism too far and suggest, well, everyone was racist back then, so it was just these people were trapped by their historical circumstances. I completely disagree, because people in the past, people in the 19th century, actually articulated a position of full racial equality for Black people. Not everyone was racist back then. So if it was seen as racism in the 19th century, you're not judging the past by the present. You're judging the past by its own terms. And we have Joseph Smith, who was a product of the 19th century, who sanctioned Black male priesthood ordination. We have Orson Pratt, who is an apostle and also a product of the 19th century, who advocated for Black male voting rights in 1852 in Utah Territory. Sidney Rigdon, a product of the 19th century, articulates a position of Black racial equality in the 19th century. These are all people who are products of the 19th century who are articulating positions of equality. Therefore, everyone is not racist back then. And that presumption is also grounded in the sense that, well, all white people are racist back then, because Black people certainly recognize slavery as wrong. And are advocating for full Black equality, including people like Frederick Douglass. So you're erasing all of the other minority groups who are experiencing racism and suggesting that, well, they're just happy with this system. So in all of those ways, it's just a really horrible explanation and justification, trying to defend the racial restrictions through historical circumstances, and it doesn't hold up to historical scrutiny.
Especially, as I understand it, at least over time, as you get into the 20th century and you go through the civil rights movement and you get into the 1970s, the ban wasn't ended until 1978. But you can't use this excuse in the 1970s that everybody's racist, especially after the civil rights movement. And so it just it puts you in a pickle if you're doing this.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And we teach the rising generation, they need to rise above the cultural norms of their day, right? And yet we can't expect people in the past to rise above the cultural norms of their day, even if they were norms. But like I said, it ignores the fact that there were immediate abolitionists who are arguing for full Black equality and immediate emancipation of slavery. That existed in the past as well.
So maybe just to round this episode out and conclude, this information and kind of looking at some of these justifications, this is going to be hard for a lot of members of the church to swallow, just because a lot of members still believe that the priesthood ban was sanctioned by God. And I think there are going to be a lot of people that might get a little defensive as they hear this information, they hear this position. What advice would you have for them to kind of give them kind of a soft landing space when it comes to this issue?
Yeah, I think my frustration is I wish that Latter-day Saints were willing to recover even the open racial vision of the revelations that began the Restoration. Like I mentioned before, we have 5 revelations that say the gospel is to be taken unto every creature. By the turn of the 20th century, we have church leaders who are saying, don't actively seek out people of Black African descent for conversion even. There's a reason why it became a white church in the 20th century. So my position is simply, let's not deny or defend this, but what if we used our own racial story to stand in places of empathy in the 21st century? What if we acknowledge that Latter-day Saints participated in racism in the past? We confess, which is a part of repentance. We confess our racial past. We openly acknowledge it. We also then say we have learned the consequences of participating in racism. We also experience a soft form of racism, outsiders suggesting that Latter-day Saints weren't quite white enough in the 19th century, racialized as unfit for participants in democracy. So instead of being hobbled by our racial past, what if we used it as a resource to stand in places of empathy? We participated in racism. We've come to learn its consequences. We experienced a soft version of it ourselves. And therefore, what better people in the 21st century to stand in places of empathy and to speak out on issues of racial justice than Latter-day Saints? Rather than be hobbled by our past, what if we used it and turned it to our advantage to actually take a proactive stance against racism in the 21st century? That's what I hear President Nelson actually asking us to do.
Love that. Thank you, Paul. And I, if I might add, it's really important that we listen to our Black brothers and sisters when it comes to this issue. I mean, obviously, we're all, three white people up here, and perhaps we haven't felt the consequences of this priesthood restriction as acutely as our Black brothers and sisters. So it's important that we listen to them, and we've got some interviews that, off the top of my head, there's one I'm thinking of that has come out, and we'll be having more coming out, that put those voices forward. And it's also something that you're trying to do as well from a historian's standpoint with Century of Black Mormons, which we talked a little bit about in the last episode. If you haven't checked that out yet, go check that out. Also check out Paul's book, Religion of a Different Color. What other stuff should they check out from you? You've got a whole host of things.
There's the Faith Matters interview with Terrell Gibbons, and then the Faith Matters short essay that's available at the Faith Matters website. I don't know if you guys cross-promote other people.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. You've been on all sorts of stuff. Maxwell Institute podcast, LDS Livings podcast. You're just type in his name and you'll find all sorts of stuff. Anything else to add before we close?
No, I don't think so.
Good to go. Guys, thanks for watching. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you both.